The Velcrin Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their ships were faster than anything most species had ever seen, and their weapons could turn entire planets into dust and ash within hours, and they had never lost a war, and they had never met a species that could stand against them for more than a few weeks. And when they discovered Earth in the year 2247, they expected nothing different from this small blue world on the edge of unexplored space, and they thought humans would surrender just like everyone else had done before them. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Force vessel Defiance and watched the massive Velcrin warship approach through the darkness of space, and the alien vessel was so large it made his ship look like a toy in its dark hull was covered with weapons that could destroy his entire fleet with a single volley. And Jake knew that everyone on his bridge was scared, but nobody showed it because they were trained military personnel and they had a job to do, even if that job seemed impossible. Lieutenant Amy Sullivan sat at the communication station and her hands moved quickly across the controls as she monitored the incoming signals from the alien ship, and she looked up at Jake with worry in her eyes and said that the aliens were hailing them and asking for a response, and Jake straightened his uniform and told her to put the transmission through, because there was no point in delaying the inevitable conversation. The view screen flickered to life and showed a towering alien creature that stood at least 8 feet tall and had 4 eyes that glowed with a strange orange light, and its skin was dark gray and covered with plates that looked like natural armor. And when it spoke, the translation computer turned its words into English, and the voice was deep and filled with arrogance and contempt. The alien introduced itself as War Master Kral and said that it commanded the Velcrin invasion fleet, and that humans had one choice and only one choice, and that choice was to surrender their world immediately and without resistance. And Kral explained that the Velcrin had conquered 1,000 worlds, and that humanity was primitive and weak and alone in the galaxy, and that resistance would only lead to death and destruction. Jake listened to the entire speech without interrupting, and when Kral finished talking, Jake smiled, and the smile seemed to confuse the alien, because most species either begged for mercy or threatened revenge, but nobody ever smiled. And Jake said his name was Commander Jake Morrison, and that he represented the Earth Defense Force, and that humanity would have to decline the generous offer of surrender. Kral's 4 eyes narrowed, and the alien leaned forward and said that humans were making a terrible mistake, and that the Velcrin would return in 1 week with their full invasion fleet, and that humanity should prepare to witness the power of the Empire. And then the transmission ended abruptly, and the view screen went dark, and everyone on the bridge sat in silence for a moment. Amy turned to Jake and said that their intelligence report suggested the Velcrin had over 500 warships in this sector alone, and Earth only had 73 ships in the entire defense fleet, and the math was simple and terrible, and they were outnumbered by more than 6 to 1, and that was assuming the Velcrin didn't bring reinforcements. Jake nodded slowly and told Amy to get him Director Lisa Harper at Earth Defense Command, because it was time to show the galaxy what humans could do when someone threatened their home, and Amy sent the message, and within minutes the secure channel was open and Lisa's face appeared on a smaller screen. Down on Earth in the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, Lisa Harper assembled the best military minds that humanity had to offer, and she called in Captain Brandon Cole, who was a tactical genius that had revolutionized how humans thought about space combat. And she called in Dr. Helen Grant, who was the physicist whose theories had given humanity faster-than-light travel, and she called in Colonel Pete Dixon, who was a grizzled veteran that had trained every special operations unit in the solar system. Lisa stood at the head of the conference table and looked at each person in turn, and said that the Velcrin Empire had given humanity 1 week before they invaded, and that the aliens thought humans were primitive and weak, and that they had no idea what humans were capable of when they were backed into a corner and fighting for survival. Brandon leaned forward and his eyes were bright with intensity, and he said that he had studied every bit of intelligence they had on Velcrin tactics, and that the aliens were predictable and relied on overwhelming force and technological superiority, and that they had never faced an enemy that thought differently than they did, and that gave humans an advantage. Helen adjusted her glasses and pulled up holographic displays that showed detailed scans of Velcrin ship designs, and she pointed out that their ships were powerful, but designed for conventional warfare, and that their shields operated on a narrow frequency band and their power cores were centralized, and these weren't design flaws to the Velcrin because nobody had ever exploited them before. Pete crossed his arms, and a grim smile appeared on his weathered face, and he said that the Velcrin had conquered 1,000 worlds. But he would bet everything he owned that none of those worlds had special forces, and none of them had Marines. And he would guarantee that none of them had humans who refused to quit, no matter how bad things looked. Lisa looked at each of them and said that they had 1 week to prepare a welcome, that the Velcrin Empire would never forget, and that failure was not an option, because if Earth fell, then humanity would be enslaved or destroyed, and neither option was acceptable. Across the solar system, humanity mobilized for war, and factories that had been building consumer goods and civilian equipment now churned out weapons and ammunition around the clock, and scientists worked without sleep developing new technologies and adapting existing ones for military use, and on every ship and station and settlement, humans prepared to defend their home with everything they had. The Velcrin had made one critical mistake, and that mistake would cost them dearly, and the mistake was assuming that because humans were new to the galactic stage, they would be easy to defeat, and the Velcrin had no idea that humanity had spent its entire history fighting wars and adapting to impossible situations, and overcoming odds that should have destroyed them. Commander Jake Morrison stood once more on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the countdown timer tick toward 0. And around him his crew worked with quiet efficiency, and each person knew their role in the desperate plan they had devised. Over the past week, and nobody talked about the odds because everyone already knew the odds were terrible, Amy said softly, that the Velcrin fleet was entering the system and that sensors were reading 473 warships, and that was even more than intelligence had predicted. And Jake could feel the tension on the bridge increase, but nobody panicked and nobody gave up because they were human, and humans didn't surrender. Jake took a deep breath and opened a channel to all Earth Defense Force ships and said that this was Morrison, and that everyone needed to remember they weren't trying to win through force, because they couldn't match the Velcrin ship for ship, and instead they were fighting smart, and everyone needed to stick to the plan and trust their training, and show these aliens why you never threaten a human's home. He gave the order to execute Protocol Defiance, and every ship in the Earth fleet began moving. According to the plan they had rehearsed 100 times, and the die was cast, and there was no turning back, and the Velcrin expected a quick slaughter, followed by an easy occupation, but instead they were about to learn their first lesson about humanity. And that lesson was that humans don't surrender, and humans adapt, and humans fight dirty when they have to. And most importantly, humans protect their own no matter the cost. The Velcrin invasion fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, and it was a display of military precision that had terrified countless civilizations across 3,000 years of conquest. And War Master Kral stood on the command deck of his flagship called the Eternal Dominion, and surveyed the primitive human vessels scattered before him in what looked like complete chaos and disorder. Kral muttered to his second-in-command that the humans were pathetic and couldn't even form a proper battle line, and that this would be over within an hour and maybe less, and he felt confident that this would be another easy victory to add to his long record of successful conquests, and he had no reason to think otherwise because every other species had fallen just as easily. What Kral didn't realize was that the scattered formation was exactly what Commander Jake Morrison had planned, and the chaos was deliberate and carefully choreographed, and every human ship knew exactly where it needed to be and what it needed to do, and the Velcrin were seeing what humans wanted them to see. Jake gave the order for all ships to fall back toward the asteroid belt, and told them to make it look panicked, and to sell the performance, and make the Velcrin believe that Earth's forces were retreating in terror, and the human vessels turned and fled, and their movements appeared chaotic and desperate and completely disorganized. The Velcrin fleet pursued eagerly and spread out to encircle what they saw as a retreating enemy, and Kral ordered his ships to increase speed and not let the humans escape, and he wanted to end this quickly and return to Velcrin space with news of another successful conquest, and he never suspected that he was flying directly into a trap. Aboard the stealth ship, Shadow Captain Linda Hayes watched the Velcrin fleet pass within kilometers of her position, and her ship and a dozen others, like it had been coated with experimental stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to Velcrin sensors, and they had been hiding in the cold darkness of space for 3 days, waiting for this exact moment. Linda whispered to her weapons officer to target the command ship's power distribution nodes, and to make precision strikes only, and she reminded him that they weren't trying to destroy the Velcrin ships but just blind them temporarily and disable their most important systems, and the weapons officer nodded and prepared to fire. The Shadow and her sister ships fired simultaneously, and dozens of small missiles barely larger than a person streaked toward the Velcrin capital ships, and they weren't powerful enough to penetrate the shields, but that wasn't their purpose, and each missile carried an electromagnetic pulse generator designed specifically to disrupt Velcrin technology. The effect was immediate and devastating, and across the Velcrin fleet ships suddenly went dark, as their power grids overloaded and shields flickered and died, and communication systems failed, and in the space of 30 seconds the mighty Velcrin armada had been reduced to hundreds of floating metal coffins drifting helplessly in space. Krall screamed orders at his crew, but half his systems were offline and he couldn't understand what had happened, and he shouted, asking how the humans got behind them, and how they penetrated the shields, and his crew had no answers, because this had never happened before in 3,000 years of warfare. On the Defiance, Jake allowed himself a tight smile and gave the order for Phase 2, and told all missile boats to open fire and to target propulsion systems only, and not to waste ammunition on anything else, and from positions hidden throughout. The asteroid belt modified mining vessels emerged from hiding. Each mining vessel carried hundreds of kinetic missiles, and these were cheap and simple weapons that the Velcrin shields had been designed to stop easily, under normal circumstances. But without power to their shields, the Velcrin ships were completely vulnerable and exposed. The kinetic missiles slammed into engine assemblies and fuel lines and maneuvering thrusters, and ships that had been immobilized by the electromagnetic pulse strikes now became completely helpless and unable to move or maneuver or defend themselves, and they just floated in space like sitting ducks. Back on Earth, director Lisa Harper watched the battle unfold on tactical displays, and Colonel Pete Dixon stood beside her and nodded with satisfaction and said that the Velcrin were used to fighting other conventional militaries, and they parked their big ships in space and slugged it out until someone won. Pete explained that the Velcrin had never fought guerrilla warfare in 3 dimensions, and they didn't understand asymmetric combat, and they expected their enemies to fight the same way they did, and that was their fatal weakness, and humans had exploited it perfectly. Lisa watched as another wave of human attacks disabled more Velcrin vessels, and said that they couldn't keep this up forever, and that eventually the Velcrin would adapt and learn from their mistakes, and Pete agreed, but said that by then Phase 3 would be underway. Aboard several of the disabled Velcrin ships, something unexpected was happening, and small breaching pods that had been launched during the confusion of the initial attack attached themselves to airlocks and maintenance hatches, and the Velcrin crews were struggling to restore power and didn't notice until it was too late. Lieutenant Danny Foster led his Marine squad through the corridors of a Velcrin cruiser, and the aliens were larger than humans, and stronger too. But they had never fought soldiers trained in close-quarters combat, and the Velcrin warriors wore ceremonial armor that looked impressive but wasn't designed for fighting in narrow corridors. The Velcrin carried energy weapons that were devastating in open space, but slow to aim in tight confines, and Danny and his squad moved with brutal efficiency and used flash grenades to disorient the enemy, and then moved in with close-range weapons for quick takedowns. Every tactic the Marines used had been refined through centuries of human warfare, and these were fighting styles the Velcrin had never encountered, and within minutes the Marines had secured key sections of the ship, and Danny reported over the comm that the bridge was secured and that engineering teams were clear to proceed. Dr. Helen Grant's plan had been brilliant in its simplicity, and the question she asked was why destroy Velcrin ships when you could capture them and use them against their former owners and engineering teams, followed the Marines and quickly assessed the alien technology and began learning how to operate the systems. Within hours, human technicians were learning to operate Velcrin weapons and navigation systems and communications arrays, and they were turning the Empire's own technology against them, and each captured ship made the human fleet stronger. War Master. Kirall finally managed to restore communications to a handful of ships that had avoided the worst of the human attacks, and what he saw made his blood run cold, and of his fleet of 473 ships, less than 100 remained. Under Velcrin control, the rest were disabled or captured or fleeing, and Krall couldn't comprehend how this had happened, and he whispered the question of how these primitives had defeated the might of the Empire, and how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Commander. Jake Morrison's face appeared on Krall's view screen, and Jake said that the Velcrin had fought 1,000 wars the same way, and that humans had been fighting each other for their entire history, and every war taught them something new, and every battle made them more creative. Jake told Krall that the Velkrin wanted to conquer humanity, but instead they had just given humans their ships and their technology and their secrets, and Krall's 4 eyes widened in horror as he understood what had happened and realized the magnitude of his defeat. Krall ordered his remaining ships to retreat and to fall back to Imperial space and to warn the High Command that the humans were not what they thought and that everything they believed about primitive species was wrong, and his ships jumped to hyperspace and fled. As the surviving Velkrin ships disappeared, Lisa Harper addressed the Defense Forces and said that this was just the beginning, and that the Velkrin would come back with more ships and new tactics, but that humans had sent them a message, and that message was clear and simple. Lisa said that Earth doesn't surrender, and humanity doesn't quit, and anyone who threatens their home will learn exactly why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and everyone who heard her words knew that the real war was just beginning. 6 months after the failed invasion, the Velkrin Empire's High Command convened an emergency session, and the massive chamber on their capital world of Velkros Prime had hosted victory celebrations for 3 millennia. But today, it hosted something unprecedented, which was a debate on how to handle a species that had not only resisted conquest, but had captured 1/3 of an invasion fleet and turned those ships against their former masters. High Admiral Zerthak addressed the assembly, and his aged form was rigid with fury, and he said that the humans used trickery and deception and fought without honor, and that they must assemble a fleet 10 times the size and crush Earth utterly and leave nothing but dust and ash. But Sub-Commander Mira was a younger officer who had survived the battle, and she stood in opposition and said with respect that this was exactly what the humans expected them to do, and that the humans studied their enemies carefully, and every ship the Velkrin sent taught them more about Velkrin technology, and every captured vessel made them stronger. On-Earth Director Lisa Harper stood before the United Earth Council and presented a very different kind of war plan, and Captain Brandon Cole had spent months analyzing everything they had learned from the captured Velkrin ships, and his conclusions were revolutionary and would change how humans fought this war. Brandon explained that the Velkrin Empire controlled 800 star systems and highlighted a holographic map of known space, and said that the Velkrin ruled through fear and overwhelming force, and that the species they had conquered hated them and resented their oppression. Brandon said that humans weren't just fighting the Velkrin, but should be liberating their subjects and turning them into allies, and Lisa nodded and said that they couldn't match the Empire's industrial capacity or population, but they didn't have to, because they just needed to break the Velkrin grip on the galaxy. Captain Nicole Bennett of the newly christened Earth Defense Force ship Freedom's Call volunteered for the first liberation mission, and her ship was one of the captured Velkrin cruisers that had been retrofitted with human technology and painted with Earth's colors and symbols. Nicole would travel to the Kryn system, where a peaceful species called the Miran had been enslaved for 2 centuries and forced to work in mines and factories, and Nicole stood before her crew, which was a mix of human and Miran volunteers who had been rescued from labor camps on the captured ships. Nicole said that their mission was simple, and they would jump into the Kryn system and knock out the Velkrin garrison and give the Miran people the chance to take back their world, and she emphasized that they weren't conquerors but liberators, and that made all the difference. The Freedom's Call emerged from hyperspace above Kryn Prime, and the Velkrin garrison commander named Sub-Leader Korth scrambled his defensive fleet of 20 vessels, and he had expected this might happen eventually, but was confident his forces could handle a single ship, even if it was a stolen Velkrin cruiser. Korth was wrong about many things, and his first mistake was underestimating how well humans had learned to use Velkrin technology, and his second mistake was not understanding that Nicole's tactical officer, Lieutenant Sam Porter, had trained for months on these exact systems. Sam reported calmly that he was launching denial drones and small automated drones spread throughout the combat zone, and created false sensor readings and jammed communications, and the Velkrin ships found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate with each other. One by one, the Velkrin ships were disabled by precise strikes from weapons they had built themselves, and it was humiliating and devastating, and within 2 hours the entire garrison fleet was floating helplessly in orbit and completely powerless. But the real battle wasn't in space and on the surface of Kryn Prime. Colonel Pete Dixon led a special operations team to capture the Velkrin Central Command facility, and with them were Miran volunteers who had spent the journey learning human combat tactics. Pete told them to remember that the Velcrin were bigger and stronger than them, and not to fight the Velcrin's fight, but to use speed and surprise and teamwork, and to make the enemy react to them instead of the other way around. The Mirren warriors had spent 2 centuries dreaming of freedom, and now armed with human weapons and trained in human tactics, they swept through the command center with stunning effectiveness, and the Velcrin garrison was accustomed to subjugating a peaceful population and had no idea how to fight an organized resistance. Within 8 hours, Kryn Prime was free, and Nicole broadcast a message that would be repeated across the galaxy for years to come, and she said that this was Captain Nicole Bennett of the Earth Defense Force, and that they came not as conquerors, but as friends, and that any world that wished to be free should call out and humanity would answer. The effect was electric, and across the Velcrin Empire subject species began to whisper about the humans who fought for others' freedom, and resistance movements that had been crushed for centuries began to reform and organize, and the Empire's iron grip began to slip and weaken. High Admiral Zerthak demanded action, and a fleet of 1,000 ships was assembled, and it was the largest armada in Velcrin history, and their target was the Kryn system to make an example of the humans and the Myran, who had dared to defy the Empire. Commander Jake Morrison, who was now promoted to Admiral, received the warning from Moran scouts, and his response was calm and measured, and he said to let them come because by the time they arrived, humans would have freed 3 more systems, and each one would give them more allies and more ships and more soldiers. Dr. Helen Grant had been working on something revolutionary in her laboratory aboard the orbital station Unity, and she completed the final calculations on a technology that would change everything, and she told Director Lisa Harper that they had cracked it and developed portable hyperspace disruptors. Helen explained that they could control who entered and exited a star system, and Lisa immediately grasped the implications and said that they could choose their battles and make the Velcrin fight on human terms instead of their own. Brandon Cole developed a new strategy he called Cascade Liberation, and instead of defending captured systems, human forces would constantly move and liberate world after world, and the Velcrin would have to choose between spreading their forces, trying to recapture everything, or concentrating their fleet and watching their empire crumble. The Velcrin chose to concentrate and sent their massive armada to crush the humans at Kryn. And when they arrived, they found the system empty, and the humans had evacuated to 3 newly liberated worlds, and each one was now defended by a coalition of freed species. War Master Kral was given command of the armada after his survival of the first battle, and he realized the trap immediately and understood that the humans weren't fighting a war of conquest but a war of liberation. And every world the Velcrin lost weakened them, and every world the humans freed strengthened them. Kral sent a message to High Command, and it was one that would seal his fate, and he said that they could not win this war with conventional tactics, and that the humans had changed the rules, and unless the Velcrin changed with them, the Empire would fall. The High Command's response was swift and harsh, and they stripped Kral of his rank for defeatism and cowardice. But deep in his quarters, the former War Master began planning something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, and he began considering whether the humans might be right. On Earth, Lisa Harper addressed the growing coalition of free worlds and said that the Velcrin had 1,000-ship armada hunting them, but that they had something the Empire couldn't counter, and that was hope and the courage of every species that had ever dreamed of freedom. The war was entering a new phase, and the Velcrin Empire had the ships and the weapons, but humanity had the will and the creativity and a growing alliance of free peoples. And the question was no longer whether the Empire could be defeated, but how many would die before it fell. The Velcrin Empire's 1,000-ship armada jumped from system to system, and they were always arriving too late because Admiral Jake Morrison and his growing fleet of liberated worlds stayed one step ahead, and they kept freeing more species and gaining more allies with each passing month, and the Empire couldn't keep up with the pace of liberation. On Velcros Prime, which was the Empire's capital world, cracks were forming in the foundation of power, and High Admiral Zerthak convened an emergency meeting of the War Council, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the assembled commanders spoke openly of defeat and failure. Zerthak announced that they controlled 600 systems now, and his voice was heavy with the weight of reality, and he said that 8 months ago they controlled 800 systems, and the humans and their allies were not fighting to conquer, but fighting to free, and he asked how they could combat an idea with warships and weapons. The answer came from an unexpected source, and former War Master Krall, who had been stripped of rank but not of insight, stepped forward, and he had been secretly gathering a group of like-minded Velkrin, who questioned the Empire's brutal methods, and wondered if there was a better way. Krall said with respect that they could not combat this idea because it was more powerful than their weapons, and he explained that 3,000 years ago their ancestors built the Empire through conquest, but they forgot why they began, and they became the very tyrants they once fought against. Zerthak's response was swift and harsh, and he shouted that Krall was a traitor and ordered guards to remove him from the chamber. But before the guards could act, something unprecedented happened, and a dozen War Council members stood in solidarity. With Krall, and the fractures within the Empire were becoming visible to everyone. Meanwhile, Captain Linda Hayes led a daring mission into the heart of Velkrin space, and her target was the orbital fortress above Velkros Prime itself, and it was a massive weapons platform that had never been challenged in 1,000 years, and nobody thought it was even possible to attack it. Lieutenant Greg Palmer was Linda's first officer, and he muttered that this mission was insane as they approached in a captured Velkrin stealth ship, and Linda replied that it was psychological warfare, and if they could strike the capital, they would show every subject race that the Empire wasn't invincible. The Shadow and 3 sister ships slipped past the fortress's defenses using captured Velkrin identification codes, and they didn't attack the fortress itself because that would have been suicide, and instead they broadcast a message directly into the planet's communication network and bypassed every security system the Velkrin had. The message showed footage from the freed worlds, and it showed Moran children playing without fear, and Kryn engineers working alongside human scientists and former slaves now living as free beings. And it included an offer that said the Velkrin people were not always conquerors, and their own history spoke of a time when they sought knowledge and peace. The message offered the Velkrin a chance to reclaim that heritage and invited them to join in building a galaxy where all species could thrive together, and the effect was profound. And across Velkros Prime, citizens saw images they had been told were impossible. Many Velkrin dismissed it as propaganda and lies, but others, especially the young, began to question what they had been taught and started asking why the Empire needed to conquer and enslave, when cooperation seemed to work so well for the humans and their allies. Director Lisa Harper received an encrypted message from an unexpected source, and a group of Velkrin officers led by Krall wanted to meet, and Captain Brandon Cole argued it was a trap, and Colonel Pete Dixon insisted it was worth the risk because any chance to end the war without more bloodshed had to be explored. Lisa made the decision herself and said she would go, and if there was a chance to end this without more deaths, they had to take it, and Pete insisted on coming with her along with several Marines for protection. The meeting took place on a neutral space station in an unclaimed system, and Lisa, flanked by Pete and the Marines, entered the conference room to find Krall and a dozen Velkrin officers waiting, and they looked nervous and uncertain. Krall began speaking, and his 4 eyes met Lisa's with an expression she hadn't seen in a Velkrin before, and it looked like shame and regret, and he said that they represented a growing movement within the Empire, and that they believed the endless conquest must end. Krall explained that they could not simply surrender because their people would never accept it, and they needed something else. And he proposed a grand council with representatives from all species including the Velkrin, and not a human empire replacing a Velkrin one, but a true coalition of equals. Krall said that his group would help humans end this war, but in return, the Velkrin people must have a voice in what comes after, and they couldn't be treated as defeated enemies but as partners in building something new. Pete whispered a warning to Lisa and said it could be a delaying tactic where the Velkrin rebuild while pretending to negotiate, and Lisa nodded, but she saw something in Krall's eyes that reminded her of former enemies from Earth's history who had genuinely changed. Lisa said they would consider the proposal, but any agreement must include the immediate freedom of all enslaved populations and reparations for the harm caused, and Krall nodded slowly and said it would be difficult to convince his people, but perhaps that was the point, and perhaps it was time the Velkrin learned to face difficult truths. While diplomacy proceeded in secret, Admiral Jake Morrison prepared for the possibility that negotiations would fail, and Dr. Helen Grant's team had completed work on a weapon system that could disable Velkrin ships without destroying them, and it was a humanitarian approach to warfare that the Velkrin had never conceived. Jake told his commanders that if they had to fight the Velcrin's final armada, they would fight to disable and not to kill, and every Velcrin soldier who survived would go home and tell others that humans didn't slaughter them when they could have. And that message was worth more than any military victory. Captain Nicole Bennett now commanded a small fleet of mixed human and Moran ships, and she tested the new disable-only doctrine in a skirmish at the Torvin system, and the Velcrin garrison expected a brutal battle, but instead found their ships disabled and themselves offered medical assistance by the very enemies they had come to fight. The garrison commander was a young officer named Prell, and he asked Nicole a question that would echo through the Velcrin military, and he wanted to know why humans spared them when the Velcrin would not have spared humans. Nicole's answer was simple, and she said that the war ends when everyone recognizes each other's dignity as thinking beings, and that killing was easy. But building something better required mercy and strength, and Prell and half his garrison defected to the coalition. That day, back on Velcros Prime High, Admiral Zerthak faced a choice, and his intelligence reports showed that the Empire was crumbling from within, and defections were increasing, and subject populations were rebelling, and the humans and their growing alliance were unstoppable not because of superior weapons, but because they offered hope. Zerthak could continue the war and watch his civilization destroy itself, or he could accept that the galaxy had changed, and the Velcrin Empire's age of domination was over, and in a private meeting with Kral, he made his decision. Zerthak told Kral to arrange a meeting with Director Harper and make it official this time, and he said that if the Velcrin were to survive as a species, they must adapt, and the humans had taught them that much at least. The Grand Summit convened on Station Unity, which was a massive space station built jointly by humans and Miran and Kryn, and a dozen other freed species, and it was neutral ground and symbolic of the new era that might be born from years of conflict and bloodshed, and everyone who attended knew that history was being made. Director Lisa Harper entered the main conference chamber flanked by Admiral Jake Morrison and Captain Brandon Cole, and across the vast circular table sat High Admiral Zerthak and former War Master Kral, and representatives from every major faction within the Velcrin Empire, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The chamber also held something unprecedented, which was representatives from all 800 systems that had once been under Velcrin control, and some came as free peoples, and others were still technically subjects of the Empire, and all came with hope and skepticism in equal measure because peace seemed both possible and impossible at the same time. Lisa spoke first, and her words were translated instantly into hundreds of languages, and she said that 3 years ago, the Velcrin Empire came to Earth expecting an easy conquest, but instead, they found a species unwilling to surrender, and that this war was never about human dominance, but about freedom for all species to determine their own destiny. Zerthak responded, and his voice carried the weight of a civilization facing its own reckoning. And he said that the Velcrin Empire had stood for 3,000 years and brought order to a chaotic galaxy, but also brought suffering and oppression and death to countless billions. Zerthak continued and said that Director Harper and her people had shown them a different way, and not through words but through actions. And they fought not to conquer but to liberate, and they could have destroyed the Velcrin, but instead offered them a chance to change and become something better. A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates, and some Velcrin officers looked angry at what they saw as capitulation and surrender, but others, especially the younger ones, nodded in agreement and seemed relieved that someone had finally said what they were all thinking. Kral stood and addressed his own people, and said that he had commanded fleets that enslaved worlds and believed he was bringing civilization to primitive species, but he was wrong, and the humans defeated them, not because they had better weapons, but because they fought for something greater than themselves. Kral explained that humans fought for each other and for strangers, and for the idea that every thinking being deserves freedom, and that this was not weakness but the greatest strength in the galaxy, and many in the chamber nodded, and even some of the hardline Velcrin officers seemed to consider his words. Captain Nicole Bennett, representing the Freed Worlds Coalition, presented the proposed treaty, and she called it the Unity Accord, and explained that there would be no more empires and no more conquest, and instead, a galactic council where every species had a voice and where disputes were settled through dialogue and not warfare. The debate lasted for 3 weeks, and hardline Velcrin commanders argued that the Empire should fight to the last ship and die with honor rather than surrender. But they were increasingly outnumbered by younger officers who had fought against the humans and survived because of human mercy. A Moran elder named Sorrel, who had spent most of her life as a slave in Velcrin labor camps, delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations, and she said that she had every reason to hate the Velcrin because they took her freedom and her family and her world. Sorrel continued and said that she had learned from the humans that revenge and justice are not the same thing, and if they built this new galaxy on hatred, they would only create new cycles of violence, and the Unity Accord offered something better, and not perfect but better, and that was enough to begin. On Earth, Colonel Pete Dixon watched the proceedings from the war room beneath the Rocky Mountains, and beside him Dr. Helen Grant monitored the status of the Coalition fleet, which was ready to respond if hardliners attempted a military coup to stop the peace process. Pete asked Helen if she thought it would work, and Helen adjusted her glasses thoughtfully and said that the treaty might work. But the bigger question was whether species that had been enemies for millennia could learn to be neighbors and friends. But if humans could forgive the Velcrin for trying to conquer them, then maybe anything was possible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, and a group of young Velcrin officers, none older than 30 standard years, made a public statement that resonated across their civilization, and they said that they did not build the Empire, and they inherited it, and they refused to inherit its guilt, and they chose to build something new. The generational divide within Velcrin society became the key to peace, and the older generation could save face by claiming they were making concessions for the sake of their children, and the younger generation could embrace change without feeling like traitors to their heritage. On the final day of the summit, the Unity Accord was put to a vote, and of the 800 systems represented, 743 voted in favor, and 27 voted against, and 30 abstained, and it was enough to move forward. High Admiral Zerthak, in his final act as the leader of the Velcrin Empire, dissolved the imperial government and transferred authority to the newly formed Galactic Council, and he declared that the Age of Empires was over and that the Age of Cooperation should begin. But the hardliners did not go quietly, and a faction of 200 Velcrin warships led by the uncompromising Admiral Drex refused to recognize the accord, and they fled to the Outer Rim and vowed to rebuild the Empire and return to restore what they saw as the natural order. Admiral Jake Morrison was tasked with stopping them, but Lisa gave him specific orders to disable their ships if necessary, but to offer them a choice, and they could join in building the future or waste their lives clinging to the past. The confrontation occurred at the edge of known space, and Drex's fleet formed a defensive formation expecting a battle, but instead Jake's coalition fleet simply stopped and held position just outside weapons range and waited. Jake broadcast a message directly to every ship in Drex's fleet and said that he knew they thought they were fighting for their civilization's honor, but honor wasn't about refusing to change, and it was about having the courage to admit when you're wrong and choosing to be better. Jake continued and said that their empire fell not because humans defeated them, but because it was built on a foundation that couldn't last, and they could fight here today, and they would lose, but would take some humans with them, or they could come home and help build something that would last forever. For long minutes nothing happened, and then one ship in Drex's fleet broke formation, and then another, and then a dozen, and by the time the defections stopped, Drex commanded fewer than 50 vessels, and his voice came across the communications channel bitter and defeated. Drex said that the humans had destroyed everything the Velcrin were, and Jake replied gently that they had freed the Velcrin from what they were becoming. And there was a difference, and in the end even Drex surrendered, and not all the hardliners would accept the new order, but enough did to ensure peace had a chance. 5 years after first contact, Lisa Harper stood on the observation deck of Council Station, which was the new seat of the Galactic Council, and around her representatives from 1,000 worlds worked together and argued and compromised and slowly built something unprecedented in galactic history. Captain Brandon Cole joined her, and he now served as Earth's chief military liaison to the Council, and he asked if she thought they did the right thing, and Lisa watched a Velcrin diplomat sharing a meal with a Miran engineer, and two species that had been enemies for centuries now working together. Lisa said that they gave everyone a chance to be better, and that was all anyone could do, and humanity had entered the galactic stage expecting to be one species among many, but instead they became catalysts for change, and proof that a different kind of civilization was possible. The Velkran Empire had planned to dominate the galaxy, and they built their power on conquest and fear, but they encountered a species that fought not for dominance but for freedom, and that made all the difference, and the Age of Empires was over, and the Age of Unity had begun.